So hello everyone. My name is Damian Shield and I'm the Senior Director at the Institute for Medical Simulation at the Center for Medical Simulation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the weekly webinars. We're lucky, I'm honored to be able to host Jeff Cooper for this session on Meet the Author. And after a few introductory remarks, Jeff, I'll be asking you to introduce yourself and have this conversation with me and with our global audience about work that you've done recently, but also about the history and future of patient safety and healthcare simulation. The Center for Medical Simulation, most of you might know, is an independent nonprofit based here in Boston, Massachusetts that serves the Harvard teaching hospitals as well as their national community in simulation. And Jeff, having been our founder, of course, knows all about it, and we're here in great part for his effort. And I myself joined about 4 years ago. I'm also an emergency physician based at the Brigham, and along with my colleagues, the host and coordinator of the weekly webinar series. We created this weekly webinar series, and Jeff, if you don't mind going to the next slide, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we were really interested in being connected internationally with both our colleagues and our graduates, and really try to make a difference in what we can do as healthcare simulation educators and patient safety folks as we were headed into the unknown and had to socially distance, and really remaining connected, remaining relevant, and learning were our goals. And I invite you to visit on our website many of the recorded sessions from previous weeks, as well as returning for announcements on future weeks. You can go to the next slide, Jeff. I'd like to propose our agenda for today, which will be welcome and introductions, the main conversation with the author, and this week will be Dr. Jeff Cooper, and in future sessions we'll be inviting other leaders in healthcare and simulation to present their current work. We'll take questions from the audience through the Q&A. Please feel free to interact with us by placing your comments in the Q&A box. I'll be able to relay your comments to Jeff while he's giving us a presentation, as well as during the Q&A section. And at the end, I'll be helping us wrap up with some future opportunities, let you know about the next few weekly webinars that are coming up and some other sessions. So I wanted to ask Jeff, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of your background and trajectory. Sure. It's, I know you're not fully retired, you're definitely very active in both our community and in several other venues. So I don't want to go to say that it's the end of your career, but it certainly has been an illustrious one. And you're a professor at Harvard. So tell us all about your background and how you got here. And
well, I'll give you the very, very short version. So I got to the Mass General in 1972 in what was then called the Department of Anesthesia. I'm a biomedical engineer by training. And during the 70s, got to do some research in what was the early research in human error in anesthesia, and use that work to really create a whole career around patient safety, and help to found the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation, and started his research program, which ended up funding a couple of the early simulation projects, including Dave Gaba's. That's how I got to know him. And it was through that I became introduced to simulation and saw simulation as being this incredibly valuable tool for patient safety. So I come to simulation through the lens of patient safety, not just through education. So when people ask me, what do you do? I say I'm a patient safety guy. And we started CMS in 1993 I managed to get all the anesthesia departments of the hospitals affiliated with Harvard Medical School to collaborate and throw the money in and support it, and get the first mannequin. Actually, it was the first mannequin off of the assembly line from that was company then MedSim, which is no longer in business, at least not that MedSim. And it's from that CMS came, we changed the name from the Boston Anesthesia Simulation Center to the Center for Medical Simulation in, I think it was 1997. So we've been operating over, I guess it's close to 25 years, maybe it's 27 years. And through that, I was the executive director. And also during that time, my career as a biomedical engineer, I was running the Department of Biomedical Engineering. First, I was the associate director starting at around 1980, and we created this Department of Biomedical Engineering at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And later, when it was merged in the mid-90s, I was the director of biomedical engineering for the healthcare system. So I was doing the simulation and the biomed work at the same time, and retired from the biomed work in 2009, and then kind of got more semi-retired a few years ago from CMS. So I call myself semi-retired now. Still have just the fun, active professional stuff. And I tell people, you have this to look forward to in your lives. Is the best time of my life. And if you play it right, it can be the best time of yours too. So
well,
I can.
We're lucky. Many of us have benefited from your direct mentorship, Jeff, because you have that way of influencing our thinking, and mostly by getting us to think about new things. And I thought that having you come talk about your work, this article from Simulation in Healthcare that's forthcoming, would be a way to get that global mentoring going, really multiply, because so many people would be so interested to hear about how a biomedical machine failure could be related to healthcare simulation. So really looking forward to that.
All right, well, if you like, I can talk about how that came about, how I got here. And where it starts is, so in my role as Associate Director of Biomedical Engineering back in the 80s at the Mass General, among lots of other things, I would often get involved in leading the device investigations. And it was really frustrating because when there was some failure, people would pay all their attention to the patient, and they might put the infusion pump or the anesthesia machine back in with the inventory, and we wouldn't be able to find it, or they would throw out the pump set and you wouldn't really know what happened because you couldn't get the disposables, and found this very frustrating. So I went about writing a protocol and started to train people for how you respond to a critical event. And in 1993, with my other colleagues from Dave Cullen from MGH, John Eichhorn from Beth Israel, was then Beth Israel Hospital, Jim Phillip from Brigham and Women's, Bob Holtzman from Children's Hospital, we published these administrative guidelines for response to an adverse event. And I wrote the draft of this and was working on this in the late 80s. And I think we had just approved these as a guideline within the Harvard Medical School Department of Anesthesia. And so I had them, and somebody called me from the operating room, one of the technicians. I was responsible for all the biomed, including the clinical engineering in the OR, which is really where my life started, was the clinical engineering group in anesthesia in the OR. And it was later that it was hospital-wide. So somebody called me and said, we just had a fire in the operating room, and could you come down and help out? So I threw on some scrubs and grabbed these new administrative guidelines and took them with me to the operating room. And fortunately for me, there was a technician there, his name's Bobby Mancuso, who was actually a technician for surgery, and he already done the right things. He didn't even know about these guidelines. He had sequestered the laser, it was a CO2 laser, and he had sequestered all the drapes. And what had happened was there was a young patient who was having a relatively simple elective gynecological procedure, and she was in the lithotomy position. I'll show you a video about this in a few minutes. And during that procedure, a fire suddenly burst out. And they threw saline on the drapes. They got the fire out, but not before the patient had third-degree burns on the back of her thigh and the back of her calf. So here I was in the operating room, and the surgeon is asking me, geez, what should we do? And so that's a whole other aspect of the story that's not in the paper that if people are interested, I could share. But the one thing I wanted to do was follow these guidelines. The part of it is make sure that we learn what happened. How did this event happen? And immediately the surgeon was, geez, this laser failed. That was her opinion. And it failed, and that's what started the fire, because as she said, I just moved the wand aside and suddenly this fire burst out. And so the question was, what happened? And that's how 30 years later, I came to write this article the case of the inadvertently triggered laser.
So you're saying, Jeff, you were actually there moments after the fire.
Correct, yeah.
This was like you actually got to essentially be at the scene of the crime.
Yeah, it wasn't crime, wasn't crime.
But from the beginning, really fresh there, and that's so great. I also really enjoying hearing from you because I read it in the page, and I hope that our audience does too. The difference between reading it on the page and being able to hear the excitement and intensity from you. So this is great. Tell us more about how that happened that day and kind of what happened subsequently.
Yeah, well, it was a sentinel event in my life. There are lots of aspects of it that I just won't forget, and I won't be able to talk about all of those here. There just won't be the time, but I wanted to concentrate on the aspect of what turns out what we did of using simulation, or you could call it a reenactment, to investigate this event to learn what happened. Because again, there were other lessons from this, but that particular experience was really important for me. There was an intensity around talking with the surgeon about how to talk with the patient's mother and those kinds of things. And then this whole investigation itself was just really fascinating. So here we are with the laser device, the CO2 laser, which was locked in a closet. And again, fortunately, the technician had saved the drapes, which were critical. And so I knew enough to say, well, this is a serious event. It'll probably be litigated. So we shouldn't be the ones investigating it on our own, because people would wonder if we tampered with something. So I contacted somebody I knew. It was then what was then called the Emergency Care Research Institute, is now called ECRI Institute. And I knew the person there, Mark Bruley, who was their forensic investigator, among other things. And they had a consulting arm. So I called our insurance company, name it's called CRICO. It's a captive insurance company for the Harvard Medical School hospitals. And I contacted somebody there. I said, look, if I get ECRI Institute, then Emergency Care Research Institute, to come here, would you pay for it? And to my surprise, they said yes. I think it cost like $2,000 back then. Again, this is 30 years ago. So I called Mark. He flew to Boston. I think it was probably like 2 days after the event happened. And we managed to get an empty operating room, which is much harder to get these days. But then we could get an operating room. It actually was room 10. I remember that. And we went into the room, and it was Mark's idea to do this recreation. And I'm going to show you a video. We videoed the entire thing. And this is in the days when video cameras were these big, huge things. They were, like a home recorder. It wasn't a professional one. And we videoed all of it and actually had the surgeon and the scrub nurse were both there. I don't recall if the anesthesiologist was there, frankly. The video I'm going to show, they had already left the room. But we, again, under Mark's direction, recreated this whole event. So I'm going to show that video now, and you'll be able to hear Mark's voice, and he'll talk about some of it, and I'll stop it and explain a few things as we go along. So you can see here that this is the lithotomy position that the patient was in, with the legs up in the stirrups. And you'll see Mark talk through it. This is a resuscitation mannequin. And this, again, is an operating room. And I don't know who this fellow is here, or this person is here. But Mark's partner who came along will be in the background. So I'll play it now, and let's see what Mark says.
A CPR resuscitation mannequin in place of the patient with legs in a general lithotomy position as they were during surgery. The articulated arm for the CO2 laser was generally located in this area prior to use and immediately after use, from what we can recall. Most of the setup has been performed, and the draping has been performed with the assistance of who was the instrument nurse on the case.
By the way, we bleeped out the name of the nurse. He mentioned her name, so we bleeped that out.
A CPR resuscitation mannequin in place of the patient with legs, and immediately after use, from what we can recall. Most of the setup has been performed, and the draping has been performed with the assistance of who was the instrument nurse on the case. The CO2 probe was about here prior to the It's used for cauterizing a switch. This is the foot switch that activates the laser. It's apparently activated once. Okay, pull back. It's activated once. This was moved out of the way, and then the foot switch was also moved back out of the way.
So I'm just going to leave this up here and make a couple other comments about this. Again, before Mark did this video, the surgical team was there. The nurse set up all the drapes. The surgeon talked through everything that she had done. And one thing that you don't see in here is what the surgeon did, what we think happened. He didn't demonstrate this in the real case. So the surgeon's practice was to kick the foot switch out of the way so that she wouldn't accidentally hit the switch. Because in those days, there was no standby for the laser, which there is now. So the laser, when it was on, it was on. You couldn't temporarily shut it off. And she knew that if she hit the switch, it could momentarily activate the laser. So what we're almost absolutely sure happened is when she kicked the switch away, she momentarily tapped the switch. And what we demonstrated, but I'm not showing that all video here, is, and you could see this when you laid out the drapes, the burned drapes, you could see where there's a pinhole in the top. Can you see my cursor there, Damien?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a pinhole right here in the top drape. And then below that was a burned drape. And there was a cotton drape that was on the footboard below here. Sorry.
Mannequin.
On the footboard below. And that drape was all burned. So what happened was when the laser was accidentally activated, it shot through the top drape, and the laser had some cooling nitrogen. So the nitrogen would prevent a fire from starting in the top drape. The laser shot through the top drape, hit the cotton on the bottom there, and as Mark demonstrates I'm not showing that in the video, you could just by a little bit of a touch on the switch, you could hit a very dry cotton drape and it would smolder and then burst into flames.
This is like the CSI investigation recreating the moment, and you've got it here on video. This could be the first in situ simulation. I don't know if it'd been documented prior, Jeff, but you got simulation equipment and real equipment into not the actual operating room, but an operating room, and then recreated, brought the participants back and talked to them about it. So that's, seems like you got a lot of insight from this process.
Yeah, and again, I credit Mark Bruley. I mean, it was his insight. I would have thought to do this. I called him as a forensic expert. He just recently retired. And by the way, his name he's mentioned there. I offered for him to be a co-author, but he said he didn't, I had already written the paper, but I would have been happy for him because he did help edit it. And this was as much his as mine, but he said he didn't feel like he needed to be or wanted to be a co-author. So I just acknowledge his work in this. But his work in setting this up and how meticulous and methodically was really critical. And I believe that if we hadn't set this up and watched the surgeon go through it, and particularly the kicking of the switch, we never would have put these pieces together. Now, it turns out, I think, as we mentioned in the paper, the company was out of business. So if there was a lawsuit, what would have likely happened is the patient would have had to sue the hospital. There would have been no manufacturer to go to, and there would have been a court battle for years of, what happened. Now, I'm not sure whether the insurance company was totally happy with what we did or not, frankly, because we found out what happened. In Mark's report, he pretty much still was saying it was the surgeon's fault, if you will. And I think is with all accidents, it's much more complicated than that. And we can talk a little bit about that. But they were able to settle more quickly because it was pretty clear that it wasn't the laser didn't fail. And by the way, we did all the tests of the laser and we couldn't find any mechanism by which the laser would have failed and created this fire. But it was the recreation and having the real people there, I think, that was critical. So when you do simulations like this, and I've done a few other of these over the years, I don't make a regular business out of it. It'd be interesting to do. It's just there's not a lot of demand for it. And that's, by the way, why I wrote this paper. That I feel like it's really important for and would be valuable for simulation organizations to make contact with the patient safety and quality people in their organizations and offer simulation as a technique for root cause analysis. And that was the focus of this paper. That's why I wrote it, because this just still generally isn't being done. And I don't get to do it very often. I haven't done it for years. Again, I have done it. And when I've done it, it's just been exceedingly valuable. And by the way, Dan Raymer was asked to go to a hospital in another city, and he ran a simulation, a post-event simulation, not with a device failure, with some other kind of failure, and had all of the participants present, all the real players.
So, okay, so I hear you say, you know, we should be pitching to our safety and quality folks that we can help them. So what's the pitch? What are we saying to them?
When you have an event where you are doing a root cause analysis and you're not really clear what happened, it doesn't all fit together, and there isn't necessarily an explanation, then consider doing a recreation. I'll call it a simulation, but I could also call it a recreation. Recreate the event. And it can be done with the real participants, but sometimes that's really not appropriate. And you want to have other people come in and play the roles, because that's typically what's done in aviation. And one of the classic teaching videos in all of simulation, of course, is the famous Why Planes Crash. It comes from the Nova series in the 1970s. And what you see there is the 9 minutes of the recreation of that crash. Of course, not by the crew, because they all died, but it's recreated in a simulator, an L1011 simulator, by the other pilots. And it was only through doing that recreation and playing it out, and through the cockpit voice recorder and the participants saying what the people did who didn't live through it, that they were able to really piece through the subtle human factors issues of why that plane crashed. So I think there are lots of healthcare events that also we could get deeper into the root causes if we do these kinds of recreations. And that's the kind of thing to talk to your patient safety people about.
And I could see it that I could offer, okay, when you have something complicated that's not seeming like you're seeing the obvious answer, call us. We could help you recreate it. We could recruit subjects and bring them through, see how people would behave. We could analyze and create videos of normal responses. It sounds like also we could say, you know, put us on your call list, even if it's something that's happening, and just have us see it, and we'll gather the data and recreate it right away. Don't wait until it's too complicated. Let us be a partner in problem solving and investigating.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and this video is just fascinating. So,
you know, a couple of things I want to mention for people to think about if they do this, because the idea of having the actual players being present is something you have to give a lot of serious thought to. I did do another recreation with a group around an infusion pump failure several years ago, and we had the actual nurses there, and it only became clear when we did the simulation that there were not good feelings between those two nurses, that one was angry with the other because of how the event had played out and blamed the other one for the event. And yet it was still by doing that recreation and having the nurses walk through what they did, that we could understand better how the medication error occurred.
This is so great, Jeff. Both you and I are working on several clinical event debriefing projects, both at Mass General.
Yeah, right.
And this conversation is really bringing forward the parallels here. So when you get people to talk about and reflect on real cases right after an event or at the end of a shift, you are dealing with some of that, including the interpersonal, but also, and a lot of surprises at times.
Yep.
Here you're saying, well, even if this is a simulation, it's in a way, it's a clinical debriefing.
Yeah.
That's delayed by a few days, and it's being not just recalling, but you have an adjunct to the recollection, which is doing it again. And this could really amplify, shed light and amplify. And so as the field, I think I'm sold. I'm convinced that the field should move into this. We can offer a lot, both from the representation and the debriefing point of view. And I'm starting to think, oh, well, colleagues around the world, they'll have to do the work of discovering what gets amplified when you do this, what gets lost, what's interesting, what are the guidelines for this. So this is great.
Yeah, when you do the debriefing right after the event, it's called a hot debriefing, as you know. And I would say this is a cooler debriefing, and a cold debriefing might be a week or two later. And there are times when each one of those is appropriate, just like there are, again, rare times, because it's expensive to do a recreation like this. But you could do it much more cheaply. You don't need to use a fancy simulation center. You don't need to bring the forensic investigator in. And if you got a team to do it, you could do this. But I don't want to underestimate or people to take lightly the dangers of having the whole team do it together like this and recreate it depending upon the event. That is, if things happen and people aren't happy with each other, it could be super hot in that conversation. And I think hotter than in a simulation, that when you're simulating the real event, that could be super hot between the people. Yeah. So you got to know what you're doing.
Because it reignites, even if it cooled down, the representation simulation could reignite it.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to get one other question in before you keep on going, because you mentioned the malpractice and the risk for litigation and the settlement and the worry about it. And that would be running high for me too, because in simulation, that's protected educational and it's not real. In a clinical debriefing setting, I'm thinking it's peer protected. It's for learning too. What are those concerns, and how does the malpractice insurance company and the risk management group react, and what are the things to at least discuss with those groups when we head into this?
Well, again, this event was 30 years ago, and those kinds of issues really weren't a concern to them. Now, I would be concerned. I wouldn't do this without being clear about the peer review protection locally. Again, I think it can be managed just like we're managing it with hot critical incident, critical event debriefings, that you can make it peer review protected, although the laws depend on your state. So before doing this, and then recording it, you'd want to do that. If it's an event that might be litigated, you'd want to talk to your risk manager in your hospital before you did this and have them involved and take the precautions, which we've done before. Again, in the medication error event I mentioned, we video recorded that, much easier to do because we could use a little handheld camera, but the nurses did not want to be recorded. So they agreed to allow us to record it as long as we didn't have their faces in it. So we did the recording, but just always kept it below so you couldn't identify them. So that's an example of the kind of thing you have to be thinking about if you're doing one of these with the real people. And so I think talking to your risk manager, that's your link to the insurance company, and assuring that anything that you do is acceptable to them and doesn't create more exposure.
So quality and safety and risk management, this is going to be a three-way partnership.
Yeah. And if you make the contact with your quality assurance, your QA and safety people, quality and safety group, which all hospitals have something like that, then they're the people who would put you in touch. They're the people to start your partnership with. Meet those people and say, hey, I saw this neat article, and saw this video, this podcast or webinar, and do you want to talk about this? Maybe there's someday that there'll be an opportunity for you to do this, and then if it does come up, they'll help you think through these kinds of issues, including, do you want the real people there or not?
What else do you have prepared to tell us more about the article and the process?
Well, so that's the event. Again, my main theme and why I wrote the article, and I think the theme for this discussion is about using simulation for incident investigation. But I think for this audience, for people who are interested, the whole process of getting something like this published, the peer review process, the things that I went through might also be interesting. And so a question, as you and I were talking about this, that came to mind, because I hadn't really thought about it much, is, why did it take me 30 years to publish this? I started thinking about it, I think probably 2 or 3 years ago. That was always on my mind, but I hadn't thought to publish it. And way back, I couldn't have. I mean, the insurance company and the hospital really wouldn't want me to, even though the case was settled, so it was done. And so I never really, I did, by the way, publish another event that didn't have simulation involved, but it was another engineering event that involved a burn from a neuromuscular stimulator. I said stimulator. And that was also another investigation, but we didn't have to do a full scale simulation to get to the cause. We just rebuilt it, and we could figure out from an engineering sense what happened. And we published that and talked about how the engineering group, and me personally, by not really supervising it closely enough, what that mistake was in modifying a piece of equipment and how it ended up hurting a patient. So it's not that I've never published anything about that, but this one just seemed like it was too hot, if you will, no pun intended. But it hit me a few years ago when I was giving a lecture, and I used this video. I went back and I pulled it out, and I described this event, and it just reminded me about it all. And I said, I think people need to know about this. I think it would be helpful. So that's what prompted me to start writing it up and just write the story and think about submitting it. And it probably took me, I don't know, it was till I was semi-retired, if you will, till I had more mental space and I could just write something like this, that I actually got to do it.
So I noticed the guidelines that you showed us before were published as a special article, and this is also a special article. So that's special, that's different. Yeah. It's not a research paper, it's not a position or an editorial. So how did you come about, what does one do to publish a special article? What's the process?
Well, I didn't start it out that way. When you're thinking about publishing anything, you have to pick your journal, and there are all kinds of considerations in what journal do you want to submit to first. That's a whole conversation in itself. And for me, I just had to have the conversation with myself. And I thought first, by the way, I submitted it to the Joint Commission on Quality and Safety, because I thought it's the quality and safety people that need to hear about this first. And what I got back, I can't remember if there was a reviewer or I just got a letter back from the editor that they weren't interested. And one of the comments was, if this is such good stuff, why isn't everybody doing it after 30 years? Which I thought was a pretty stupid comment for an editor. But then again, anytime you're an author and you get the comments back from the reviewers or the editor, that's your first defensive reaction. So I didn't think that was I still frankly think that was not an appropriate comment, because the reason people aren't doing this is because people don't know about it. There are very few publications. And by the way, there are some, and I reference those. There are more recent ones, and I reference those in the paper. So there are people who talk about using simulation for root cause analysis, and some examples of it, and also for failure mode effect analysis. That is it's kind of the opposite. It's doing the simulation about a process before you actually start it, so you can find out where the possible failures are. And simulation is equally, if not more, useful, has the more utility for that application. But I submitted it to that journal and it got shot down. And so I thought, well, I'll submit it to the simulation audience because I think they'd equally be interested. And maybe I had an in. I didn't use any. I didn't try to influence anybody. I just submitted it to Mark Sherbo, to the journal, as an author, and he sent it out for review, and the reviews were good, so they accepted it. And I think most journals, if you look through their guidelines and you see where they have some allowance for special articles, and often you can just write to the editor and say, look, it depends on how big a journal it is and how much time they're willing to give to you. The New England Journal isn't going to, but other journals will, and you can write and say, geez, I have this idea. Would you have any thought about it? Or you just do what I did. You just write it because I wanted to write it. I wanted to write the story.
That sounds so scary, but I guess in practicality, you write an email, they write you back. Worst they can do is say no, or give you an idea of what, where to put it in a different format or in a different journal. So take home here is you have an idea, either write it up or write to the editor and say, hey, is this interesting?
Yep.
And then I found that the peer review process is generally takes, you know, you get a lot of feedback in the process. You have to really, it's a lot of work, a lot of iterations, but it generally contributes to the outcomes. Frequently, I find myself acknowledging the reviewers and saying, you know, like, that was really a great contribution. And so kind of describe, if you don't mind, some about your peer review process here in this special article category, and how your ideas might have been suppressed or encouraged. You know, what was that like?
Well, first, as anybody who's an author, I'm sure can tell you, for some or most of their articles, getting that letter back from the editor telling you the things that, and reading the reviewers' comments can be very painful, especially when they reject you. And you can't be doing this kind of work without getting some rejection. And when you get it, just try not to be defensive. You will be anyway, but try not to be, and just really seriously look at what the reviewers have to say. And in this case, the reviewers had some really great points. And it really made it a better article. You know, one good example was, I was convinced that without this simulation, we never would have figured out what happened. And I wrote that in the first draft when I submitted it. And one of the reviewers said, well, how could you know that? Because you didn't compare it to a root cause analysis without simulation. It's like, well, yeah, you're right. So in rewriting the article, I acknowledge that. I don't know for sure, but and actually, not only do I not know for sure, when the reviewer put it that way, it didn't just make me write it differently, it made me view it differently. That of course I don't really know. And then I really started to think, geez, could we have found this with a root cause analysis? And I really don't know.
And isn't that so typical, right? To be biased so positively towards our own ideas and towards and also towards our actions. Like, of course it was a good idea. We did it.
Yeah, and right. So, but in this case, I was a great comment, and it taught me something, and I was able to modify the article in a way that was acceptable to the reviewer, and it made the point. There was another comment. One of the reviewers was just really into the whole topic of doing investigations and all the different root cause, because the original article was using simulation for root cause analysis. And one of the reviewers was like, oh, root cause analysis, almost like it's passé. Like if you come from the engineering field, the human factors field, you know, it's just one technique and it's not the best technique. And here are all these other techniques, and that I should have had much more in the article talking about all the various techniques of accident investigation and how simulation fits with that. And it's like, well, by the way, two of the ones that he mentioned, one was called FRAM, and I forget what the other one was. I'd never heard of them. And so again, this was a great point where I learned from the reviewer. So I went back and I looked these up, and I got another paper, one that he recommended, and then another paper and a book about other accident investigation methodologies. And I allude to it in the article, but I asked the editor, who fortunately agreed with me, if I could just not get into that, because first of all, there's a word limit, and there's no way I could get deeply into that subject.
Right. It's like, you don't want them, if they're asking you to do a major review and change your whole paper, sometimes that's appropriate, and sometimes you have to talk back and say, well, you know, I respectfully will incorporate that idea, but we're not going to change all of that.
Right.
It's always a risky thing, because you risk being rejected. But I think my experience, having not that, you know, of course, not as much experience publishing as you have, but or many, people seem to, they're trying to help you make your paper better. It's a suggestion, and they respect when you respond point by point to the reviewer comment and say, yeah, we did think of that, but we're not doing it because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah, generally that works. It doesn't always work. And I can tell you, as an associate editor, and I manage a lot of papers, and one is fresh in my mind. Actually, it's actually the most recent one, I think, where I was reviewer. This wasn't one as associate as the editor. I was a reviewer, and so there was a paper where they responded to the comments of, there were, I think, only two reviewers, And almost every comment of mine, and when I review, by the way, I usually have 20 comments. I'm a very thorough reviewer and editor. And almost every comment, they always start, thank you so much for your thoughtful comment. And it was so condescending because they didn't accept any of my comments. It's like, I'm serious, 20 comments. It's like, I think one thing, they changed something in the paper. And it was so condescending, and it wasn't, and I had to stop and think, look, maybe my comments aren't that useful, but no, there were things that they could have changed in the paper and addressed. There was no reason not to. And that paper got rejected. I mean, I wrote back to the editor and said, I'm just really disappointed in the response because they didn't respond to any of my comments. So I'd be careful about it.
Yes.
When you do it, but don't just be diplomatic and say, thank you for your thoughtful comment, but we don't care. We're not going to respond to it anyway.
Well, like you said, you incorporated the citations, you reviewed the literature as suggested, absolutely, but you didn't go back to explore the possibilities of simulation in each of these.
Correct.
So we've got a few people who are watching this session live, and so I would like to invite them to start thinking about what they're interested in hearing more about. So for those of you who are joining internationally and from across the US, we'd like to invite you to introduce yourself on the Q&A chat there, and also provide a question or two. I think that'll help Jeff and I direct the rest of our time together towards new and interesting topics. And so I know we have Jeff, you probably have a few more ideas to share about the paper and the process. In the meantime, we'll invite folks to comment, and I'll be bringing those to you, Jeff, as I'm reading them.
One of the questions that you always struggle with as an author is what belongs in the paper and what doesn't. And there was one really other interesting fact about this particular investigation that came out, not from the recreation, but I wouldn't have thought of it without the recreation. And that was about the Footswitch, which actually is in the next slide here. Let me see if I can. So this is the Footswitch. I saved this. I still have this Footswitch from 30 years ago. I forget where I put it when I moved, but it's around the house somewhere. And the thing that was interesting, that I only allude to it in the paper, I don't go into detail, is that this Footswitch has a spring in it, and the spring had gotten a little bit floppy. So I believe that it was easier if you accidentally, when the surgeon went to push the switch out of the way, when she went to do that, it was easier probably to make the switch activate because the spring was probably a little light. And as far as I know, there are no maintenance requirements. There's no standard for how heavy that spring has to be, but it was a pretty floppy switch. And what was interesting that
technical term there, floppy.
Floppy, yeah. It was a little weak. The spring was weak, and it was easy to activate, easier than I think it should have been. But in the report that Mark Bruley wrote, it was only mentioned briefly. He didn't really give it the strength that it should have had, I think, that it made it easier for the surgeon to depress the switch hard enough so that it would activate the laser. And if there were some culpability, it was like, well, I was the associate director of biomedical engineering. That group reported to me. You could have argued that somebody should have been looking at checking the spring periodically, which I don't think anybody does. And by the way, another kind of switch you can use, which we didn't use because they got a new laser. They retired that laser and got one with a standby. But for the switch like this, you can buy, and I don't know if they're all made like this, where you can't press the switch unless you put your foot all the way in, and there's a lever in the back, and you have to push that lever before you can push down on the switch. And that's another protective mechanism. But I didn't get into all that in the article because it wasn't relevant to the article.
Maybe in a ergonomics and human factors audience, that might be part of the key message in terms of forward. But here, this wasn't. I always find it so interesting to talk to authors about what else was going on that didn't quite make it. So, one of the other areas that I'm interested in, Jeff, is done some work with the society around fellowships in healthcare simulation. And actually with colleagues, we're writing a special article about a debate we did around accreditation. But this conversation around opportunities for healthcare simulationistas in patient safety and quality or in collaboration has gotten me thinking around what are my own learning gaps? What don't I know about patient safety and quality that I maybe should know? And I'm fellowship trained healthcare simulationista. So if you had to kind of brainstorm here, what do you think could be part of the core curriculum of people in training in healthcare simulation? What should we know about patient safety and quality that's super high yield?
Well, there's so much I can't immediately give you.
Or where to start, even if it's not the whole
certainly
curriculum, where to start?
Certainly the basics of patient safety. I mean, most people don't understand about how accidents happen, the fact that you shouldn't be blaming the people. It's really the system, what the system issues are. I see, to have a deep understanding about what's the process by which things go wrong in healthcare or in any industry, and how this kind of work is done in other industries as well. And certainly root cause analysis and other root cause analysis, because it is the most popular common technique that's used in healthcare for investigating adverse events. So that is something that I have people generally learn about that technique, both using simulation, which there is a program for. Jared Cutson and oh my goodness, just my good friend out in California, Connie Lopez.
Connie Lopez.
Connie and Jared put on several great workshops using simulation to teach root cause analysis, and they have a paper about that. I don't think that's in the references. So that would be those are, first, the basis for patient safety and how things go wrong. Generally speaking, how you go about preventing not errors, but recovering from errors, and then how you investigate adverse events. Those would be core topics that I think people would want to learn about.
Yeah, and I think thinking also as a physician, there's whole system-based practice would align with this idea of the systems are part of the accident, and like you're saying, it's the heavy clog that the surgeon was wearing. It's the kicking of the switch. It's the spring of the switch, where you place the laser on the drape. All these things have to align together for the fire to actually ignite. And I don't think I find myself frequently thinking that way, especially my lens on healthcare simulation is so much about high performance and competency and excellence and skills and reflective practice. So I think potentially a recommendation is for people who are training in healthcare simulation to get that systems-based patient safety.
Actually, this event, if you wanted to teach a course in that, this event is a great event. You could take this and ask people to think through, what are all the contributors of this event? How would you do the root cause analysis? And instead of what the forensic investigator did was kind of put the onus on the surgeon, which I think is the wrong thing to do. It's, how did the system contribute to this? Because that laser was an old laser that didn't have a standby switch. So what is the process in a hospital for determining what equipment is obsolete? There could have been a laser standby nurse, which I think most hospitals didn't have, some were having at the time. What are all the things that to think through and use this event, not just to learn about how to use simulation to investigate, but to use the simulation to help you learn about how events happen. So this might be a great story for that.
Well, I think this has been really helpful to think about an actual event, your process for you to write it, and thinking forward about how simulation can help solve these kind of problems and others. I know at CMS, we're focused on solving institutional problems, healthcare problems, educational problems. And here you're giving us one more window. I wonder if you might, just looking at the chat messages and what we're, in wrapping up here, I wonder if you might take a chance and give us a glimpse of the future, and what are some other opportunities that you think folks in simulation could contribute to going forward? Where's the field going? What will it evolve into?
Well, that's a big question.
Should we invest in plastics? Plastics,
Yeah,
right?
plastics, Benjamin. Yes, for those the few people who's actually seen The Graduate at least once. Yeah. So I don't have a crystal ball. When people ask me to prognosticate about anything, especially about the current world, I've just given up. I don't have any confidence in my predictive ability for anything anymore. So given that caveat, I'll still say that given especially the current circumstances of the crisis we're in and how much we've seen remote learning has changed what we're doing. Years ago, I was saying I think most physical simulation is going to go away, not all of it. But I think we're seeing now how people have been forced to adapt to use remote learning and virtual reality and all kinds of techniques like that to do simulations, to do education. And I think we're learning how to do it better. I don't think all the physical will or should go away, but for people who aren't jumping in and using this crisis as an opportunity to develop their online techniques and tools, you're missing the boat. I'm really challenged by it, frankly. Even a webinar like this, it's like, how can you make a webinar like this really interesting? I mean, I don't know. Is it, for the people who watch it, you got to tell us, is this the way to run it? Or should it be something else we should do? Because I talked with some friends today. I was on a call with, a webinar with, or a Zoom call with. It's like, well, how do you make them really interesting? And
I've got my kids singing in the background, so I hope that's making it interesting.
Yeah, right. I have my background off the horses has come by, but I try to get the horses to come by to make it interesting. But it's like, how do I, as a speaker, alter the way I speak to keep you engaged? Because I know there are people on the call, they're doing what I'm often doing, is they're multitasking. They're doing something else, and I assume they're multitasking because that's the way of the world. If they're in an audience, it's like, well, you can't do that. Don't look at your phone, but that doesn't work anymore. So how do we use that to our advantage? What do I do in the way I speak and the way I use my slides and how I change the slides and the nature of slides to make these kinds of presentations better? So I think for all of us as educators, we have to be using this crisis as an opportunity to get us think about how to do all of this a lot better. I know a lot of people are. I mean, I see this going on, so it's great.
I think you're the master of this. I mean, this very paper is Crisis into Opportunity.
Yeah.
You took the event, you did get summoned to the fire, but then you turned it into an investigation and lots of other investigations, and now a publication that hopefully will seed further work. And through this mechanism, we just got a chance, Jeff, to publish a series of interviews that you did with my colleague Mary Fay on our website about the history of simulation. And I just think you've had that talent, and you called it serendipity, but really you've just been relentless in taking those opportunities. And I personally really appreciate that as a model, but also for what it has given us in healthcare, in patient safety, for me as a career. So I want to say that in gratitude for your work, but also for joining us today in this session.
All right. Well, thanks so much. This has been a lot of fun. I hope it's of interest to people, and hope we'll get some feedback about it.
If you don't mind clicking to the next slide, I have a couple of closing thoughts to share.
There we go.
So, because we're trying to innovate through the pandemic and built on about almost 10 years of teaching online, we have several programs available to all of you. We've got Dash Radar training, which sounds kind of dry, but it's a peer faculty development strategy around debriefing training. You get to really elevate your evaluation of other people debriefing on your own. join us for that training tomorrow, or every quarter we offer it. Janice Palaganis was pictured here. She's also leading the feedback course, a longitudinal multi-week series of sessions. I found that course to be excellent in terms of transforming what we were talking about, receiving feedback, whether it's from the editor or from your colleagues or your everyday life. There's feedback in everything, and that course really helps you work through that. And this very week, we're in the middle of our Healthcare Simulation Essentials course. We've moved the whole curriculum online, and I personally think it's thriving. Folks who are interested in healthcare simulation are rapidly getting into simulating and debriefing online, as well as changing all their aspects of themselves as an educator. And Jeff, next slide, if you don't mind. I want to let people know that the next 2 weekly webinars, next week, we've got an open forum, ask anything. When you register, you get to post some questions. Ann Mullen, our program manager, and myself bring other faculty from our team and answer your questions live and get into some lively discussions and debates. We certainly don't all see it the same way, and we'd love to talk through both the literature, the practice, and the future as we see it. And then the next week, another really great innovation, if you can click one more time, Jeff. Design thinking informed simulation. So this is not the root cause analysis, but the design, the innovation to test, evaluate, and modify the clinical infrastructure. Chris Hicks, Andrew Petrosniak, and Carrie White, they're going to be interviewed by Jenny Rudolph. She's going to be moderating the panel on presentation on how they're using design thinking informed simulation to make us better, stronger, faster. And I think that's going to be a great session. They're a great team from Toronto, and we're excited to have them here. I can't remember if we've got one more slide there or not, but I want to, oh yeah, that's me with a beard from before COVID, and my colleague Mary Fay, and together we'd like to finally invite any of you with specialized problems in your institution. If you need some help getting started with healthcare simulation, if you need to rapidly develop a curriculum or broaden your faculty development opportunities, give us a call. We'd love to help you out, get a sense of where you're at, and see if we could be a part of it. So thank you, everybody, especially Jeff, for joining us today, and Anne for organizing the session. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it, as I certainly did. And I look forward to seeing you all for next week's session. Thank you so much, and good night.
Good night.